And one of the biggest problems when I was there was the challenge of changing the culture from let's make sure nothing goes wrong to one of we need to produce nuclear weapons yesterday because Russia and China are churning these things out like sausages.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the second episode of European Fault Lines. As you know, we're trying to illuminate the fault lines where security policy succeeds, but also where it can fail. However, fault lines can't be explained in isolation. They sit where pressure meets material that can no longer hold. For this reason, we need to start with the fundamentals, which is why we'll be taking a closer look at Europe in the age of strategic exposure. Our first guest to do so is Frank A. Rose. From 2021 to 24, he was Principal Deputy Administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration. Before that, under President Obama, he was Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, Verification and Compliance. In between, he was a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, where he co-directed the Center for Security, Strategy and Technology. And he writes widely on nuclear deterrence in missile defense. He has sat in the rooms where decisions are made on nuclear security, arms control and space, decisions that shape Europe's position as well. One more fault line, and this is rather one on our own, it is technical. You're hearing this introduction because we recorded it afterwards. We simply pressed the record button too late. We hope you enjoy the episode.
I didn't think this was like background music to make people go to sleep. When you get into the details of defense procurement, people's eyes usually droop, but,
right.
They're critical. And if you can't get the procurement piece right, your ability to get the military capabilities to your troops in the field, it just won't happen. So that's a fundamental problem. And, to a certain extent, we kind of lost the plot here. I mean, I don't know how it is in Germany, but in the United States, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, we had this view that the focus needs to be on accountability, oversight, and cost control. And as a result, we added all of these layers into our procurement process. So it's very difficult to get large numbers of weapons deployed quickly. For example, I remember about 4 or 5 years ago when I was at the Department of Energy, in the United States, it's the Department of Energy that actually develops and deploys U.S. nuclear weapons, not the Department of Defense. And I was with the secretary, and we were at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory looking at the models of all the weapons that Livermore had helped develop. And we got to the Polaris system, which was deployed in the early 1960s. And I said to the secretary, Madam Secretary, we developed, designed, and deployed the Polaris system in 5 years. You show me one system, major weapon system, here today that we could do that with. And the answer is zero. And it's not because we don't have the technical capability to do it. It's because we have put all of these regulations and oversight into the process, which has made it very, very difficult to move fast. And but we're going to have to change. I mean, in the past, that was probably doable, but if you look at the speed of technology, that's not sustainable if we want to maintain our advantage over our potential adversaries.
Would you just cut bureaucracy then? How do you do that?
Yeah, it is a hard question to answer because there were reasons why you put these checks in place. What I would probably do is, 2 or 3 things. One, I would cut regulation. Okay. Um, Number 2, I would make it easier for um, startup companies to do business with the Department of Defense. Number 3, I would give people authority to make decisions, but I would also hold them responsible. So there are a number of things you can do. And, I have been critical of the Trump administration over the past several years for a number of actions that they have taken. But I think one area where they have done a good job is trying to make the defense procurement process work. I mean, they've been talking about, in the United States at least, defense procurement reform for 35 years. And they've never been able to get it done. Regardless of what you think about Donald Trump, one thing, in my view, is accurate. He knows how to break bureaucracy. I mean, he has cowed the bureaucracy in the United States. Now, the question is, if you're going to break the bureaucracy, are you going to use it for something good to achieve the ability to deploy weapons faster and at scale, or are you just going to do it to bash the bureaucracy? Yeah. The jury is out, but, I will have to be honest with you. What I have seen the Trump administration do so far with regards to defense reform at the Pentagon, it's pretty impressive. They've got a good set of sub-cabinet officials from Silicon Valley. They're engaging with industry. They are ensuring that having opportunities to bid for contracts. Is there more that they can be doing? Absolutely. But I think they are moving in the right direction, and I will give Trump credit where credit is due.
Frank, something that comes to my mind, given the fact that the United States were engaged in a number of wars within the past 30 years, why, according to what you just said, did bureaucracy overhead still rise in the different administrations involved in procurement?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to change culture. We have a saying in the business world in the United States, culture eats strategy for lunch every day. Now, the president may, at the senior level, be able to set the strategic vision, but unless you can get in there and actually change the culture of the people who do the work on a day-to-day basis, it is really hard to make fundamental changes. Let me give you an example. One of my jobs in government, I was the deputy administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration. We developed, designed, and deployed the U.S. nuclear arsenal, specifically the warheads. During the Cold War, our job was to produce lots of nuclear warheads. And we did that. We deployed something like over 70,000 nuclear warheads. Well, when the Cold War ended, we moved away from that paradigm, and the organization's culture moved from one of a culture focused on production to making sure what we had didn't go bad because we weren't likely going to produce lots of new nuclear weapons. So when you are trying to produce a weapon versus when you're trying to primarily sustain a weapon, it's a very different cultural mindset. So the world has changed since the National Nuclear Security Administration was established by the U.S. Congress in 2000. And we are now in a place where we got to produce nuclear weapons at scale again. However, we're running into a lot of problems. And one of the biggest problems when I was there was the challenge of changing the culture from let's make sure nothing goes wrong to one of we need to produce nuclear weapons yesterday, because Russia and China are churning these things out like sausages. And so I think that's really the challenge. It's not that these people are evil or unpatriotic. It's just big organizations have a certain culture, and it takes strong leadership and implementation to change that culture. And, we're struggling with it.
Yeah, and it's also so difficult, like give people more authority and then hold them accountable for decisions. Even making that work it's a real challenge for big organizations.
Yeah, you guys both spent, like myself, a lot of time in governmental institutions. And I think we would both agree that most managers in the government are risk averse. Okay. They're afraid at getting yelled at by the Congress or the Parliament, which totally shocks me because it's so difficult to fire people in the government.
The key question would be, can you just externalize some of these governmental function to business, right? That also doesn't work because of at the end of the day, it's like a core governmental function, right?
Yeah,
defense procurement.
Ingmar, we basically tried that in the United States in the 1990s, okay? And it was a disaster. As you said, setting requirements, that's a core government function, okay? And, we had things so screwed up in the 1990s and the early 2000s. We had the contractors setting requirements in some situations. I mean, fundamentally, and again, I keep on coming back to this point, the government was able to deliver before.
I agree that change always has to be started, especially from the top. And as you were elaborating, that it was in the past, as you say, also an absence of presidential leadership. That's at least how I understood you. But wouldn't you also agree to say that it was also due to the absence of a strategic rival?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that is, Max, a really important point. When you don't think you have a strategic adversary, you get intellectually lazy. Your focus on delivering capabilities is not what it is when you have a rival out there deploying capabilities. And if you are not at the top of your game, your rival is going to outproduce you, outthink you. So I think that has a lot to do with it. We got intellectually lazy too. During the Cold War, the German army was probably one of the best and most modern armies in the world. Indeed, the American historian John Lewis Gaddis described the Bundeswehr as the finest Cold War army in Europe. And you had some real strategic thinkers in Germany. And the person who comes to mind is Helmut Schmidt. Helmut Schmidt, who was defense minister under Willy Brandt in the early 1970s, and then he succeeded Brandt as chancellor, I think in 73, 74. I mean, he was a real strategic thinker. A lot of the writings he did in the 1950s and 60s. And then I think he was probably one of the best defense ministers that the Federal Republic had. I mean, he fully modernized the Bundeswehr. And then with regards to the Euro missile crisis in the 1970s and 1980s, people forget it was a speech that Helmut Schmidt gave at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, raising concerns about the strategic nuclear balance in Europe that ultimately led to the deployment of U.S. intermediate nuclear ballistic and cruise missiles in Germany, the U.K., and several other European states in the early 1980s. I think the fundamental problem is, after the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, people forgot that sense of strategic thinking. And much of the energy within Germany went into things like peacekeeping, development, disarmament, non-proliferation. So, and the same thing goes with the British. During the Cold War, many of your listeners will know that Britain maintained the British Army of the Rhine in Germany, or in the Federal Republic, 4 divisions and over 60,000 troops. Now, Britain would have a hard time maintaining a brigade of 3,000 troops in sustained combat operations. So again, the muscle memory is there. The capabilities were there. The problem was the political will.
US used the unipolar moment, which order emerged in the early 1990s, and where are we now?
Yeah, well, let me take those two questions in 2 parts. First, about democratic nations' ability to conduct sustained military operations. And, the bottom line is the First and the Second World War, along with the Cold War, shows that democratic nations have the political and the technical capability to effectively compete against authoritarian states. One of the examples I always refer to is the United States during the Second World War. I mean, when the Second World War opens on September 1st, 1939, the combined United States Army and Air Corps was about 200,000 men. Okay. Our army was the size of Bulgaria. All right. And on that exact day, the gentleman in the portrait behind me, George C. Marshall, was sworn in as Chief of Staff of the United States Army. When he steps down as Chief of Staff of the United States Army in 1945, the U.S. military is 8.2 million men. He will raise that army. He will train that army. He will equip that army. He will move it to just about every continent in the world, with the exception of Antarctica. And at the same time, the United States will supply a substantial portion of the military equipment. Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, Free France, and China. So anyone who says that democratic states don't have the capacity and the capability to compete militarily against the authoritarian states do not understand history. Fundamentally, the question as to whether democratic states will be able to do it comes down to political leadership. And the question of, do they have the leadership to guide the publics to the right answer?
Frank, what's your take on the order that emerged, but maybe also the order that's now emerging?
Yeah.
I mean, speaking of Brzezinski, for instance, in some of his books, warning of an axis of Iran, Russia, and China allying against the United States of America. What's your take on that? Where are we now?
Yeah. Well, let's go back to 1989. I mean, I was in college when the Berlin Wall came down, and I remember and understand the euphoria. It really felt like a hinge moment in history, and in many ways it was. But I think the West drew the wrong conclusions from it. The prevailing assumption was that the collapse of communism meant something permanent and universal, the triumph of democracy, the consolidation of liberal capitalism, and the effective end of war as a tool of statecraft among great powers. My personal opinion is that when historians will look back at those 2 decades after the end of the Cold War, I think they will describe it not as a new world order, but as a deviation from the mean, a holiday from history, as some say. The structural forces that drive great power competition, territorial ambition, and ideological rivalry did not dissolve. They were temporarily obscured. With Russia's weakness after the Cold War and the fact that China was slowly on its march upwards. In 1989, China was still a poor and developing country. I don't know if either of you read the Financial Times, but back in 2019, when I was living in Germany, in Berlin at the time, I came across a piece Gideon Rachman wrote. It's called Beijing, Berlin, and the Two 1989s. And basically what he says in this article is that watching the Berlin Wall come down and the decision by the Communist Party to attack the protesters in Tiananmen Square, it looked as if the more important of those events was the end of the Berlin Wall. However, looking back, what we may come to believe is that the Chinese Communist Party's decision to crack down on the demonstrators and maintain the role of the Communist Party, which led to the rise of this authoritarian China that we are dealing with was the more significant event. I think there's a real strong argument for that thesis. You'd asked Ingmar about kind of what Brzezinski had talked about in several of his books with regards to kind of this access of the aggrieved, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Here's what I would say. I mean, at its core, the Russian-Chinese access is a marriage of convenience with two fundamental objectives. One, frustrating and ultimately overturning the U.S.-led international order. And secondly, and I would argue more importantly, maintaining the regimes. After the wall came down in the West, and this was really believed, I think, in the United States and in Germany, especially with regards to Russia. And this view was that through trade and people-to-people contacts, we would bring Russia and China into this liberal international order. It was a very long-standing liberal idea. How could they not what we have built? Probably the best articulation that I have heard has been written by my former colleague at the Brookings Institution, Tom Wright. And Tom basically says in a book called All Measures Short of War, which he wrote, I think, in 2018, he says the Russians and the Chinese eventually saw the liberal international order, especially the focus on democracy promotion, as an existential threat to their regimes. And then they began to push back around 2007, 2008, and push back hard. I think he's right. At the end of the day, they, whether you believe their assumption or not, they thought the ultimate U.S. objective was regime change in both Russia and China. And the view was we need to work together to balance American power and preserve our regimes. So that's kind of how I think we got to where we are today. Now, did we make the most of the moment we had? I think the answer is probably not. I think we made some serious mistakes. Probably one of the biggest strategic mistakes was the war in Iraq. I think it really expended a lot of American power and resources unnecessarily. While we were fighting in Iraq against insurgents, Russia and China were preparing for the next round of competition against the United States. We delayed a lot of our major military modernization programs, like our nuclear weapons modernization program. Why? Because all the resources were going into managing the situation in Iraq and then the larger global war on terror. I think also one of the mistakes we've made, especially in the two Trump administrations, is the management of our alliances. My personal opinion is, one, given our global responsibilities in the United States and the fact that China is a much more powerful competitor than the Soviet Union ever was. We don't have the power on our own, militarily, technologically, or economically, to deal with China and Russia on our own. We need to do it in close coordination with our allies. But my big concern is President Trump doesn't necessarily see it that way. I think he has done some good things. I mean, putting pressure on NATO allies to spend more on defense. But I think fundamentally, it's really about the fact, less about Trump, more about there's a real strategic threat. That's why the allies are playing. But Trump certainly helped. But I don't think he understands the fact, and I've said this on numerous occasions over the last decade or two, America's system of allies and partners at the global level is really our asymmetric advantage against the Russians and the Chinese. It's something they don't have.
Frank, you were mentioning American mistakes, and you talked about Iraq, and you talked about mistakes of the early Trump administration, their first term. But I want to cut in between and ask you, what drove the Americans back in 2008 to promote the membership action plan for Ukraine? So what was the purpose behind it? And could the United States have foreseen what this maybe leads to? We're seeing now since 2022. And you mentioned that earlier, this alliance that we're witnessing right now between the Russians and the Chinese. Could that have been something that had been foreseen back then already?
Yeah. You know, Max, I think that's a really good question. Let's take a step back a decade before that, though. Let's go to the mid 1990s. There certainly is an argument that one of the reasons why the United States and NATO are in such a difficult place with Russia is because of NATO expansion. Okay. And, you know, I'm not one of those people who actually believe that. I mean, honestly, I would say that in the 1990s, and this is certainly the case for the United States, and it's even more the case for Germany, is that the West extended a hand to Russia in the 1990s in an attempt to better integrate them into global institutions. Was it perfect? Probably not. But those were very, very difficult times. And it's not like Russia ever had any longstanding institutions with democracy. But what I would argue is it wasn't a hostile posture towards Russia. But fundamentally, I don't think there was a lost chance. And here's why. And another colleague whose work I greatly admire, especially with regards to U.S.-Russia relations after the Cold War, is my former colleague from Brookings, Dr. Angela Stent. She wrote a wonderful book called The Limits of Partnership. And, you know, at the end of the day, her argument is that fundamentally the post-Cold War dispute was never really about NATO expansion. It was about who had the right to govern the former Soviet states and its satellites. The American view was fairly straightforward. These nations have the right to elect their own governments and associate with whomever they choose, the EU, NATO, or neither. Moscow's view was equally straightforward. Russia had a special sphere of influence in this space, and governments on its periphery must be friendly to the Kremlin. That is the core of the conflict. And one more point worth making. It was not Washington that drove NATO expansion in the 1990s. It was the newly independent states in Central and Eastern Europe that sought membership urgently and deliberately based on their own historical memory of Russian behavior. They were not recruited. It's not like we were saying, come on down. No, there were concerns. And consider this counterfactual. Had we not expanded NATO, we might be fighting in Poland or Romania today instead of Ukraine or potentially Germany. So that's my view. Now, the issue of Ukrainian membership, I was never at the time a big proponent of Ukrainian membership in NATO. And if I recall correctly, at the Bucharest summit in 2008, most European allies were not big fans of it. And Bush and his team pushed it hard. And what we ended up with is a compromise in which we left out an olive branch to the Ukrainians, which we would never fulfill, and at the same time pissed off the Russians. Okay. So it was the worst of both worlds. I think the premise we assumed, and the same thing can be said of the Baltics, we assumed that we were always going to be dealing with a relatively benign Russia, okay? And we didn't think through how we would actually have to defend these countries like the Baltics if Russia turned aggressive. So bottom line, it was a hard call. But it goes back to that fundamental issue that I identified. And that is, who should govern the former Soviet space? Do I blame the Ukrainians for wanting to be part of the West? Absolutely not. You look at the Russian model. What is attractive about the Russian model? Some countries are democracies, some are theocracies. Russia is a thugocracy. I do not see the Russian model as an attractive model for the future. So, yeah. It's a hard call. I probably would have started with European Union membership and then over time evolved to NATO. But even then, that's when the first crisis in Ukraine happens because there was that EU partnership and the Russians didn't like that. So at the end of the day, that is the fundamental clash. Who decides who will govern the former Soviet space? And they're just fundamentally different views.
But then maybe fast forward on the role of the United States, because I understand the articles that you've published, and you mentioned China and Russia being in the other camp now. Are you a proponent of basically taking them on both, whatever that means? Right. B, you've very much made the point that whenever the United States has withdrawn from the European theater, disaster happened, right? And you basically make the argument that's still a realistic perspective of the United States fast forward into the future on basically being the caretaker of Europe, and whether you think it's realistic from your own viewpoint to still play this kind of dominant role in the European theater, which then, of course, also has implications for European autonomy, however defined.
Yeah, Ingmar, I think it is a very, very important question. I mean, what I would say is I still believe strongly in, one, the transatlantic alliance, and secondly, the fact that I believe the United States has a fundamental strategic interest in maintaining security in Eurasia and preventing an authoritarian power from imposing its will on Eurasia. We've seen that happen twice during the 20th century. In the First World War, we didn't want to get pulled in, but we were eventually pulled in because the European democracies did not have the power themselves to deal with the authoritarian challenge, okay? And instead of maintaining that balance after the First World War, we withdrew, which we ended up in a similar situation where the democracies did not have the power to balance the authoritarian powers on their own. But at the end of the Second World War, we learned that lesson and we maintained a presence that remains to this day. Now, where I would make some fundamental adjustments is in the following areas. Number one, I think European allies need to dramatically improve their conventional military capabilities. And I think most European governments would agree. Secondly, I also believe they need to be putting money into enabling capabilities, strategic lift, space-based ISR. While on the other hand, nuclear umbrella, I don't think anybody wants a nuclear Germany. One of the reasons we have the non-proliferation treaty and the U.S. and the
a couple of international legal clauses in the way there. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, one of the things that I would say the activist community doesn't understand is that one of the fundamental reasons why the United States and the Soviet Union were able to agree on the NPT is because the Soviets wanted to prevent a German nuclear bomb. Okay, That was their strategic rationale. And another thing, and my colleague Susan Cook has written a wonderful article about the history of extended deterrence and the non-proliferation treaty, is the NATO allies only agreed to sign on to the NPT with very clear assurances from the United States that we would maintain our extended deterrent in Europe. So, I mean, it's a lot more complicated than people say today. So bottom line is I still think it is critical that the United States maintain a credible military presence in Eurasia. But I think it's critical that our allies make investments in their conventional capabilities, not just in Europe, but in Asia as well. And I think if you can do that effective rebalancing of responsibilities, the United States can likely maintain that domestic political consensus to keep stability. Because, if we lose stability in Eurasia, boy, we will regret it.
I would like to change again back to what we have dealt with earlier, the procurement topic. How do you see the involvement of private corporations in the wider military equipment scene? Just to name a few of them, Google, Amazon, Palantir, Anthropic, OpenAI, all these AI providers. How do you see the dependencies on those while aiming for a better equipment in the near and midterm future?
Well, let me start with answering that question specifically, and then let me give you a little bit more on what I think the United States needs to do and what I think Europe needs to do in this area. Now, regarding kind of the private companies, I think fundamentally we need to be encouraging more competition in the defense space. One of the biggest problems is we don't have enough competition. And it kind of comes back to the point that we talked earlier. When you don't have real competition, you get lazy, okay? So we've got to find a way to encourage more startups, more companies who aren't primarily defense companies to operate in the defense ecosystem. So I think competition is good. And I think one of the reasons why we've gotten lazy is, and why our defense industrial base has atrophied, especially in the United States, is that we didn't encourage that competition. I mean, you've probably heard of the Last Supper, which was held in 1993 at the Pentagon, where then Secretary of Defense Les Aspin brought in like 30 chief executives of defense companies and said, in 10 years, 80% of you will be gone. That was not a smart decision. I mean, I understand the budgetary pressures at the time, but one of the things I've learned from leading an organization that has to produce stuff is you don't want to lose your technical ability to produce defense items. Because once you lose that capability and the tooling and the machinery and the people, you can't restart that overnight. It takes time. I remember, for example, when I was the deputy at the National Nuclear Security Administration, we had the commander of Strategic Command who kept on saying, well, we'll give you more money to on the nuclear infrastructure. And the response back was, more money and resources is nice, but we just can't snap our fingers and recreate the infrastructure that we allowed to decay. So that's the first part of the question. And now here's the broader points, which I think is what I think the U.S. and Europe need to do. First, I think the United States needs to fix the procurement system. I mean, the system that we currently have was designed in the late 1960s and early 1970s primarily for transparency and oversight, not for speed. The system was the right answer to a different problem set. It is the wrong answer for today. Secondly, we need to move away from small numbers of expensive, exquisite platforms towards large numbers of lower cost systems that we can produce at scale. The goal is not to replace all of the high-end systems. You will need some of them, but to find a way to complement the high-end systems with mass and affordability. And we're seeing that today in Ukraine. Third, and this kind of goes back to the first question, integrating startups and venture capital into the defense ecosystem. Not as a side channel, but as a core acquisition pathway. And to its credit, I think the Trump administration has made some real progress in this area. Now, I think Europe's challenge is different and in some ways harder. I mean, the talent is there. I mean, Ingmar, you work, your company, you work with a lot of talented engineers. The technology is there. What is missing is a market structure to deploy it. I mean, I think the European regulatory framework stifle the kind of rapid iteration in that defense innovation now requires. And on top of that, as Mario Draghi has noted, I mean, Europe has tremendous accumulated wealth, but it has failed to mobilize its capital markets in ways to fuel high risk, high reward technology investment and innovation. So the United States has Silicon Valley. Europe has regulation.
So we regulate before there will be a second Silicon Valley.
I mean, so closing that gap is as much a political challenge as a technological challenge. Again, I mean, when I think of it, I come back to kind of where we started, and that is across the West, the focus over the last 50 or so years has been on how do we constrain the state, okay? And I think both in the United States and in Europe, we have to, put the appropriate checks on governmental power, but we also need to allow the people who run the government the authority to get the job done. Because I assure you, if we don't, the Russians, the Chinese, and other authoritarian countries will.
Yeah. I think maybe just one final word, because it's so closely related on your article on technology becoming more important than geopolitics and geostrategy. And you alluded to Harold Mackinder, and your point was that basically technology and the new technologies that we were talking about is sort of, in a certain way, replacing geostrategy and geopolitics. Was that your point there?
No. I mean, what I say throughout that article is that I don't think technology will replace geography, okay? But I think one thing that is different is we are creating new domains, okay? So we are going to have to rethink our conception and our frameworks for geopolitics. And I would say, the difference between kind of me and my thinking and Mackinder's thinking is Mackinder understood the importance of technology. But for him, technology was a means to an end. Geography at the end of the day was his prize. Whereas I think geography still matters, and we are seeing that today in the Middle East. I don't know about your electric bill and gas bill, but mine has been through the roof over the past couple of weeks. So it still matters. But there are these new ecosystems out there. There's a cyber domain. There's a space domain. There are undersea cables. And it's really hard to think how you will maintain military and technological advantage if the U.S. and our partners cannot win and maintain our edge in those technological domains.
I think we had a really interesting conversation. We started from the boring side of defense procurement, the world and global order, ended somewhere with NATO, and then all full circle back to technologies. Thank you very much, Frank. It was an absolute pleasure to have you.
It was a pleasure, Ingmar and Max. Always great to connect with a fellow King's College War Studies alumni.
Absolutely, Frank. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your outstanding contributions, Frank.
Great. It was my pleasure. Thanks so much. I hope you have me on again in the future.